If one leg is missing, then the whole thing may fall apart. Signifiers are never isolated, and so when one goes missing, the entire chain of signifiers becomes vulnerable to disruption. Often someone with a psychotic clinical structure continues to function well in society, fitting in with nearly no issue, just as a stool missing a leg often can still stand up on its own for some time. But at some point, under certain circumstances, the whole thing can become undone. This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 14 and 15 in Seminar 3. Lacan begins lecture 14 with an inquiry into the meaning of the term structure. It's a term we've often applied to clinical diagnoses, yet we've not been told much about what exactly a structure is. In Saussure's linguistics, structure identifies language as a system of differences that are in relation to one another. Claude Lévi-Strauss applied the concept of structure to culture and myth. Lacan, influenced by each of these thinkers, provides his own description of structure. What Lacan adds here to the other thinkers mentioned is a notion of structure informed by mathematical theory. This is important because, as you may recall from Seminar 2, through number sets, Lacan demonstrates certain patterns and laws that are spontaneously emerging in the application of an algorithm that deals with numbers. Clinical structures entail a set of interrelated signifiers and signifieds as realized through subjectivity. Psychoanalysis is principally concerned with the subjective implementation of the signifier. But what exactly is a signifier? Lacan indicates that it's nearly impossible to define since a pure signifier is practically never encountered in experience, but only signifiers as they are tied to signifieds, to meanings. For Lacan, the signifier is the basic element of language. It's not a sign in the ordinary sense, and it's not limited to what we typically think of as the concrete elements of language, phonemes, words, but also includes objects and symptoms. Furthermore, signifiers are always thought in relation to other signifiers, a system of differences, as Saussure suggests. These relations form chains, bound together by rules or laws that organize them within a particular constellation, forming the symbolic order. These signifiers intervene, uproot, and regulate the imaginary relation, furnishing a reality for us that's organized, serving as a reliable guide for navigating our experience. When I say the signifier uproots the imaginary, I mean it takes relations informed by natural tendencies and transforms them to be something other than what nature intended. Signifiers are central to interhuman relations. Now Lacan asks, when do we know that there's been communication? He answers that it's not in the fact that there has been some shared meaning that has occurred, something that we can never be truly sure of. Instead, it's in the registration and acknowledgement of receiving the other's speech. For example, in current political discourse, we're hearing the word critical race theory being used a lot by politicians in various contexts and for various purposes. It's clear that the meaning of this signifier is not the same among those who deploy it. For Lacan, communication is not the transmission of meanings, but is the reception and response to the signifier, in this case critical race theory, as it's circulating among subjects who are responding to it. So communication here is the sharing of the materiality of language itself, not the supposed inner sense or meanings that we impose upon those material signifiers. What we can conclude from this is that subjects are those capable of using signifiers within that play of signifiers. And it becomes most evident in deception, because it's where one readily encounters doubt about the relation between signifiers and signifieds. This establishes a pivotal difference between psychoanalysis and the natural sciences, which deal in signifiers without a subject. The signifiers of physics are exemplified by mathematical formulas and the so-called laws of nature. They are as close as one gets to pure signifiers, since they're nearly devoid of signifieds. Now, how is this the case? Let's take the example in which someone says they love me. When this happens, I'll very likely embark upon a search for what that means. In other words, I doubt the other's words to some degree. Why are you saying this to me? Do you genuinely mean it? Do you even know what love means? The signifier love takes on a kind of independence from the respective signifieds attributed to it. Signifieds that I fear are quite different for me and for the one who says they love me. And in contrast, when one of the laws of thermodynamics, say, is deployed in speech, I don't doubt it. In other words, I don't acknowledge the possibility of having been deceived by the formula. Yes, the laws themselves may be an error, but error and deception have radically different implications for the subject. Because I can doubt the other's speech, I can have some relation to that signifier, but the signifiers of the natural sciences remove this human element. Their depersonalized form are more akin to how a computer operates a program than how human speech functions, which in its intermixing of imaginary meanings allows us to enter into the activity of these signifiers on a subjective level. And so the world of signifiers for us is the human world, and it's introduced to us by going through the Oedipus complex. This doesn't mean that there was not already a kind of structuration of objects and the emergence of a subjectivity before this, that is in what is called the pre-Oedipal phase. Indeed, such is present before installing the primordial signifier and can be readily seen in young children and animals even. But through the Oedipus complex, the subject acquires and orders the signifier, which in turn allows for the process of sexuation to occur by adopting key signifiers that, though hidden and challenging to identify, find approximate incarnations in specific names we have for those things, such as man and woman. Man and woman are, first and foremost, not about stereotyped forms of behavior, such as they are for Carl Jung and dealing with activity and passivity, but are understood in relation to the authority, the law of the primordial signifier that establishes and legitimates them, making possible then the attribution of a meaning to them. Yet even when this happens, this doesn't mean that the signifier has been then submerged within a set of meanings that renders one's identity and position clear to oneself. As just indicated, there is always doubt toward the other. Such doubt renders this primordial signifier fundamentally enigmatic, and as a result, meaning is never certain. As such, a question arises about one's identity, one's life, that resists any final answer. The common defense of so-called normal, well-adjusted subjects entails the avoidance of that place where the question without an answer may be asked. Neurotics, in contrast, are those who have dared to go there. They have confronted and asked themselves the question. Although the neurotic confronts the question, they consequently misrecognize it, and it then returns in the form of the symptom. But in contrast to psychosis, one's reality remains intact. Lecture 15 furthers this consideration of structure by addressing what happens when a signifier goes missing, as in psychosis. Lacan asks, when do we decide that the subject has crossed over the limits, that they become delusional? He answers that it is when the initiative comes from the big other, the bearer of the primordial signifier. But this may be a little confusing. Isn't the big other excluded in psychosis? Lacan anticipates our question and addresses it here. To be excluded doesn't mean to be wholly absent, but rather it is an exclusion from one's internal subjective world, and instead it reappears in the real by being affirmed at the imaginary level. Excluding the big other and the primordial signifier, which seem to be somewhat synonymous terms as far as I can see, in that they're both referring to the law of the symbolic, it entails a collapse of the big other into the little other. As such, the start of the delusion is marked by the initiative coming from the big other as encountered in the imaginary intersubjective relation, what Lacan calls here an inmixing of subjects, the between I and interposed subjects. Now, this is only the start of the delusion. As we know, meanings or signifieds come into view afterward to dominate the signifier. We see this developmental trajectory in Schreber, who first encounters the speech he hears, "It really must be rather pleasant to be a woman," as surprising and disturbing. And then it's only later that a full-blown delusion will take hold as an abundance of meanings of signifieds come to dominate these free-floating signifiers that are coming from without, from the real. So what about the psychotic's relation to the question that the neurotic subject confronts, misrecognizes, and transforms? In psychosis, one comes to the place where there is a question but finds no signifier there. Or rather, the signifier itself becomes the question for the subject. Consequently, what protected the neurotic subject and allowed for the maintenance of reality, the signifier, now appears as a threatening and disturbing phenomenon in the real. In neurosis, the question, "What am I? Am I dead or alive?" for example, gets reformulated as an incessant need to keep thinking. I think, therefore I am. Thus, I need to keep thinking to exist because I keep doubting it. The presence of the signifier allows me to turn the question into a symptom that preserves my reality. But in psychosis, when confronting the question, "What am I?" there's not the internalized signifier that can re-articulate the question, and as such, the imaginary dominates the subject. And the question then presents itself in a fundamentally alien form, delivered by an imaginary other, who carries the weight of authority over and against me, but that was originally intended to bring order within me. This missing signifier is associated with the paternal function. I think it can be very tricky with this inside-outside language and to fall into this sort of trap of subject-object dichotomy. But I think it's important to keep in mind that for Lacan, the unconscious is already outside of me. It begins outside of me, and even though I might experience or think of it internally, it's only a product of having accepted the primordial signifier that I could even have that sense of having internalized what for me is now the unconscious. And so when I encounter it now in the real, I'm in a sense encountering it where it always already was. I can experience a differentiation between inside and outside, not because it's a fundamental philosophical reality, but because of my position in vis-a-vis the signifier. And similarly with the division between mind and body, that's a division that only makes sense in a subject who has been split between ego and unconscious subject. So we might even perhaps say that the experience of psychosis is, in a sense, a little bit more original. And maybe it's just for this reason that those like Deleuze will affirm the foreclosure of the signifier as a means of productivity and multiplicity. In psychosis, the missing signifier is the symbolic father, the paternal function who cannot be assumed into the symbolic. Consequently, it becomes reduced to an image, producing a radical alienation in which the subject can only apprehend themselves on the imaginary plane rather than on the symbolic one. The question now manifests as a fringe phenomenon, one that is not asked by the subject but by the masked big other, who was always already there operating behind the scenes but now appearing as the little other. Lacan adds a helpful metaphor here regarding the stool. If one leg is missing, then the whole thing may fall apart. Applied to psychosis, signifiers are never isolated, and so when one goes missing, the entire chain of signifiers becomes vulnerable to disruption. Often someone with a psychotic clinical structure continues to function well in society, fitting in with nearly no issue, just as a stool missing a leg often can still stand up on its own for some time. But at some point, under certain circumstances, the whole thing can become undone, and one then moves from a pre-psychotic to a fully psychotic phase. In moving through these two lectures, one question stood out to me above the rest. We've made some progress on the concepts of structure and the impact of the missing primordial signifier. However, we've yet to be given much guidance from Lacan as to what he means by the paternal function. How does it function as a primordial signifier? And why must it be the father? Lacan will offer us much more than he has so far in the following few lectures. He'll address the functions and truth of the Father as a signifier and what this has to do with the notions of metaphor and metonymy. I want to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you wish to support this work on Patreon, the link is below in the description. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.